There are so many little things to consider when signing up for an event like the Leadville Trail 100. Training, traveling, bike, food, and those are the big ones. What about the smaller details, like eyewear?
Now, sunglasses might seem like a no-brainer, but there are a few things to consider here. The change in light is a biggie. You start out in low light, almost, dawn. And then you head into glare and dust and then shade and sort of a stippling effect. And then, of course, sweat splashes onto your lenses. And then finally, there's the afternoon sun. And you've got a real challenge. It is why we want to tell you to go to Shimano and check out their latest eyewear.
And you're saying, Shimano sunglasses? That's right. At Sea Otter, I tried on the latest S-Fire sunglasses that now come with Ridescape lenses. Shimano's engineered its Ridescape lenses for specific conditions, including one for mountain biking. The mountain biking lens helps bring out the roots and rocks found on trails, and it does so in and out of the shade. And this is no mumbo-jumbo, folks. I tried a pair on, and the definition of certain objects really is enhanced.
Nice. Sunglasses are something you really want to get right for the Leadville 100. After all, they're going to be on your face for, at least 8 hours for most of us, so you better like them. We think a pair of Shimano's with Ridescape lenses are going to be a good choice.
To see the entire lineup of sunglasses by Shimano, go to Shimano, that's bike.shimano.com, and check out all their shades. And thanks to Shimano for being the title sponsor of the show.
3, 2, 1.
Leadville, the podcast for the 100-mile mountain bike race presented by Shimano. This is Season 6, Episode 15 of the show that breaks down, builds up, gets you ready, and freaks you out for the highest, hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country. I'm Michael Houghton, hotted most.
And I'm Fatty, and we know you're thinking about it. Maybe stressing about it. It is the thing that makes the Leadville Trail 100 the race that it is, altitude. Put the Leadville 100 course at sea level, and you've got a pretty good, an average, an off-road 100-miler. But the fact is, most of this thing is above 10,000 feet. And that makes it the highest, hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country.
I've heard that said somewhere before.
Somewhere.
Yeah. You've heard all kinds of ways to prep for Leadville's lack of air, from altitude tents to altitude camps. The best advice we've heard so far is just to get in the best shape you can and then adjust your power and speed expectations. Our guest and resident expert, lifetime Grand Prix athlete Dylan Johnson, agrees with that advice and has something to add to it that may get you a little more prepared for the race in the High Rockies.
What is a good strategy for staying ahead of the cutoff times?
What do the experts say about sleeping effectively at altitude, and what do you each do?
For Leadville, hardtail or full suspension?
Yeah, good question.
Leadville Frequently Asked Questions, LFAQs, a public service of the Leadville 100 Mountain Bike Podcast.
We're such givers on this podcast, so let's give a little again.
All right, Richard Biney posted a pic of his Leadville race bike on the participants page, and he had a question to go with. He plans to swap out his 34-tooth chainring for a 30-tooth for race day, and he's asking for feedback. Now, I couldn't tell exactly what size cassette he had, but it looks like one of those, one-by dinner plates with like a 50 or 52 climbing gear on it. But before we get into that, I thought it would be fun, Fatty, to go over your gearing setups as best you can remember over the years.
Here's where you find out how little I know sometimes, Adi. It's a question you're going to have a lot of detail on, and I'm not going to have a lot. Everyone knows I don't really think about or study equipment the way you do. So let's just say that until about 2007, I rode a 3x setup, which was pretty common back in the day. And I raced my first Leadville single speed with a 32x20. In 2012, I won the single speed with a 34x20. I had the noisiest Leadville in my life with a 46x26 belt drive in 2014, and have had a 34 up front every year since then, whether I'm on a single speed or have a cassette in the back. 34 sort of assumes you are happy with a low cadence and tend to stand on climbs like me. That works. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to most people. However, I am going to go on a limb and say you should not ride with a 30 as your chain ring. I just don't think you should. It is small, and that small ring up front means your chain is wrapping around a tighter circle, and that costs you energy. Go with a 32. Your granny isn't going to be a lot harder, and you aren't going to be wasting watts on that small chain ring the rest of the time. Also, if you're going to swap to a different chain ring, do it before July 15th. That's the date I'm setting for you, so you can get used to it. Give it some real training time before you race with it.
Yeah, I think I've even seen some folks float the idea of a 28 for Leadville, which seems...
That's too small.
Yeah, that seems crazy. I was always a 2x guy at Leadville. I rode a 3926 front and an 1136 cassette for 4 of my starts. That's a 20-inch climbing gear and a 102-inch fast gear.
That's a range.
Yeah, I always felt like I needed at least one more climbing gear, but then again, who doesn't? Like we always, right? You're going up freaking Columbine, like, God, I wish I had another gear. I wish I had another 3 gears. On the top end, I was only spun out on the Turquoise Lake descent in the morning. Otherwise, I had plenty to pedal with. One year, I did have a 3824 crankset. So like I said, a 3926 was most of my time at Leadville, but I did have a 3824 because I ended up on a borrowed bike. That gave me a 19-inch climbing gear, so just slightly easier on paper, that is. But man, that inch felt like inches to me when I started going uphill. I remember really liking that setup. The 30 10x52 by comparison, folks, is a 16-inch climbing gear. So I was basically, in that 20-inch range. And all you folks are running the 30x52 or 51. You're right around the 16-inch area with a top end of 86 inches. So certainly my 2x setup had a lot more top end than the current modern 1x systems. There's a lot to consider here. On the climbs, just about anyone would love that 3052. And to look at frictional losses when you're in a 3052 is a little useless because, everyone is just grinding at that point. The only argument might be is at those speeds, the 3052 is so slow, you're going to be off and walking anyhow, in which case you might lean towards the 32 or the 34 to gain back some of that top end. So kind of goes along with Fatty's argument in a roundabout way there. That 30 it's a great climbing gear, but are you really going to use it? Or are you just going to be walking anyhow when you're going to be in that gear? But if we set aside that extreme stuff, right, that really steep stuff where you might want to be in that 3052, the sections where you're likely going to walk anyhow, and start looking at the true pedaling sections where your speeds are above, say, 10 miles per hour. I think what you are aiming for in those sections is a gear selection, that keeps you near the middle of your cassette. That's where the chain angle is at its lowest and your frictional losses are minimized. The problem with a 30 is it puts you in that 10 or that 11 tooth cog a little too often, and your chain, like Fatty said, has to make tight turns around the cog and the ring, and you start having to work harder to overcome those tighter angles your chain is having to articulate through. If you really want to deep dive on this stuff, you got to go check out the Marginal Gains podcast that Fatty and I also are on, and Josh Portner. He discusses a lot about drivetrain optimization and efficiency and how your chain making tight turns really does cost you watts in the end. So I would say look at more than just the climbs and consider the race as a whole. Add in what you plan to do on those steeper sections, whether or not you're going to walk or not, and then consider, do I want to motor on the flats and those rolling sections? And then try to arrive at your ring size. It'll be a compromise any way you slice it, right? But hopefully you can narrow in on the best compromise for you. If I was lining up today and building a Leadville bike, I would strongly consider my old school ways, the 2x. There's now a 3624 crank and an 1142 cassette from Shimano in XT. That's a climbing gear of about 16 gear inches. And so that's right there with that 3052. Not bad, right? Plus, you get more top end. And one other thing about 2x is that the rings do not have the narrow, wide teeth profile, so they will run just a little smoother, a little less friction there. Is there more weight? Absolutely. Does this make me a dinosaur? Probably. But hey, someone asked, And so those are my 2 cents. And Fatty, I'm just hoping someone eventually asks about chain lube choices because, I could go wild on that in an LFAQ.
Oh, yeah. That'll be an interesting episode of the LFAQ because I'll do my answer in one word, synergetic, and you can take the rest of the episode.
One more thing on the gearing question, by the way. We're running a poll on the participants page asking what you plan to ride, 1x, 2x, triple, or single speed, that is. The early polling says that it's kind of says what you'd expect, actually. 94% are going 1x. 5%, surprisingly, said 2x. I've got 1% said triple, but there are no votes in there, so somehow the polling is not great. Now, as we record this, the poll has only been up 8 hours, so by the time you hear this episode, the poll should have much better data, and we expect things to change. And we expect someone to say, hey, they'll be riding single speed, right, Fatty?
Half of us, at least half of us. No, I think it's so interesting. The whole, 1x is just the default. And I really do. I think that there is a great argument to be made for the 2x. I've said before in this show a few times, my fastest Leadville ever was with a 2x. And I really loved the drivetrain setup with that. I set it up with, it was XTR Di2, and I set it up with a single shifter. So I never once made a shift to the front. It did everything for me. I set up the progression of gear shifts ahead, and Shimano took care of whether I was in the big ring or the small ring up front all the time. I was just harder or easier. That's all I ever thought about. Yeah. It was great.
And the beauty of that automation is it will keep you out of those gear choices that have frictional losses. And
it helps you not cross-chain, which is great when you are being race stupid. Mm-hmm. And at 11,000 feet, you're going to be a little race stupid. Hadi, we talk a lot about what the feed has in its inventory. That company is always on top of the latest sports nutrition. If you've heard of a bar or seen a pro taking in some kind of gel, chances are the feed has it. But what should not be overlooked with the feed is their willingness to share knowledge.
One way to smarten up on sports nutrition is to engage with one of the feed's experts via their website chat. If you're undecided about what to get or need help picking out something that matches your needs, the chat is a great place to go.
Yeah, the other way is to stay informed by subscribing to the feed's email. They got a great newsletter that is going to keep you updated on the latest of what the feed has and how it might fit into your training and racing.
I love that email. What they also do with it is share strategies. I was looking over one recently on something in the feed called Drink to Win. And we're not talking about like drink a lot of beers to win. We're talking about, what you're supposed to drink to win. It would
be a great newsletter.
I know. 3 IPAs and do 5 intervals. I mean, that's not what it said, folk. It was a terrific outline on how to hydrate your life, which sounds kind of weird. I know you're not pouring water on yourself, but I think you know what I mean here. The feed had specifics on what kind of fluids you should be taking in for those various aspects of daily life and activity. Doing a 1-hour workout with intensity, the feed says this is where you want something that tastes good and has electrolytes, but you don't need the extra sugar of the other drink options.
Yeah, the feed is obviously the best place to get nutrition and a terrific place to get information that you need to fuel and hydrate in your training and your racing.
Claim your $80 annual credit at thefeed.com/Leadville. Register your email, verify your phone number, then spend your first feed credit of $20 right away.
Hadi, I don't know if you noticed this last year, but when I was racing the Leadville 100, I don't think I ever touched my jersey zipper, bringing it up or down even once. It stayed in the same place from the starting line to the finish line. And I've noticed that is actually true for most riders.
Yeah, even on the hottest day in Leadville, it's not exactly scorching hot. Plus, a good jersey fabric will keep you cooler where it covers you than when it doesn't. And that's kind of the miracle the modern performance fabric DNA uses. Not to mention that any aero advantage of a form-fitting jersey goes kind of out the window when you pull down the zipper.
Yep. I think DNA Cycling has been thinking along those lines too, Hadi, because they recently created a new jersey they call the Summit, which is more or less like your race day jersey, but without a zipper. It has a tailored collar, a nice cap sleeve finish, a very nice close race day fit, and 3-day pockets. It is like a jersey, just no zipper.
DNA says it's comfortable like your favorite t-shirt, but technical like your best cycling jersey. And it sounds like a good option for the Leadville 100. Check out the Summit jersey at dnacycling.com to learn more.
Our feature this episode is an LFAQ in itself. How do I get ready for Leadville's altitude? And specifically, how do you backtime your arrival to 10,000 feet? Obviously, there's no single easy answer, but there are some good options.
And for those strategies, we turn to Dylan Johnson. Dylan has made long-distance mountain bike racing his profession, and he has won the National Ultra Endurance Series 3 times. He raced the Lifetime Grand Prix last year, and he's back in it again for its 2nd edition. Dylan puts thought into every race and every race situation, and in the case of Leadville, he worked very hard at getting his arrival to high altitude just right. He's here to share his approach and how the citizen racer can figure out how to lessen the blow of Leadville's biggest challenge, its lack of air. All right, again, we want to thank Dylan Johnson to the show. Dylan coming off a 16th, right, Dylan, at the Lifetime Grand Prix, and a 20th at the Leadville Trail 100 2022. And Dylan, I'll have to say, I was a little torn. Look, I was rooting for you, but I wasn't. And here's why. Because the man chasing you down, I'll have to say, I have a bit of a man crush on. That was Nicky Terpstra. Now, you beat him, barely, but I know you heard the knobbies coming up 6th Street there, the ones from a Dutchman named Nicky.
Yeah, he was breathing down my neck. It was very close, and I did not want to have to sprint him because I'm sure that it would not have been pretty for me at all. If it had come down to a sprint between me and Nicky Terpstra.
All right. Nicky's won Roubaix and Flanders. Yeah, he has a bit of a Palomares going. So, yeah, good for you, though. Good. Congrats for finishing ahead of the Pro Tour guy and for the entire season, by the way. We want to congrats for you for the entire Lifetime Grand Prix. Well done. Well done. Now, we have Dylan on to cover a number of topics. Dylan is a coach as well. He works with clients. And he's a thinking man's racer, too. I mean, this guy has got all the left brain you'd ever want in a cyclist. And if you haven't checked out his YouTube channel, you should. And that's where I got some of these topics, folks. Like, I learned what I wanted to talk to Dylan about by watching his YouTube channel. And he's got more than we're going to talk about here. But we really want to focus on a couple things with you here, Dylan. And first of all, that is a video called Going Deep at Leadville. And a lot of that focused on your altitude prep. And of course, with Leadvillers, I mean, altitude, this is the thing they probably sweat the most, that and like tires. But, the altitude thing gets in our heads, as it should, right? It is the thing that makes the Leadville Trail 100, the altitude. Tell us about your thoughts going into Leadville about altitude and what was your approach to getting ready for 10,000 feet?
So I will say that this past year, when I did Leadville, was actually my first attempt at Leadville ever. Which I guess is a little bit surprising because if you kind of know my racing history, I came up doing 100-mile mountain bike racing, the NUE series, National Ultra Endurance Series. I've done a ton of 100-mile mountain bike racing all across the country, but for whatever reason, I had not done Leadville, and I'd never done a race that was at that sustained altitude. I had done races that peaked at 10,000 feet or 11,000 feet for a brief period of time, but I'd never done a race where the entire race was above 9,000 feet. So I as far as my altitude prep goes, I have the luxury of being able to work from wherever I want. I don't necessarily need to be in a certain location. So I was like, well, if I'm going to get ready for Leadville and altitude, I might as well spend a month beforehand, more than a month beforehand in Colorado, partially just because Colorado is an awesome place to ride and an awesome place to be, but also I'm preparing my body for altitude. And the approach that I took to preparing for altitude, I got to altitude right before Crusher and the Tusher, and Crusher and the Tusher is an altitude, a gravel race in Utah that's also at altitude. I think it starts at 6,000 feet, but it goes up to 10,000 feet, so quite high altitude. I wasn't prepared for that one both from an altitude standpoint and from a fitness standpoint. I had just gotten over COVID, but I did as well as I could there. And then I would say after that is really when the altitude prep started. So I think I had a little bit over a month between that race and Leadville. And over that period of time, instead of just going straight to Leadville and staying for a month at Leadville, I kind of stair-stepped the altitude. So I stayed in Golden, Colorado. Where else did I stay? I can't remember the town in between. I stayed in Keystone, and then I ended up staying in Leadville. So I think it was about a week at 6,000 feet, a week at 7,000 feet, a week at 9,000 feet, and then 2 weeks at 10,000 feet at Leadville at the race altitude. And then, of course, spending 2 weeks in the town of Leadville, there's not a whole lot of riding there other than the course, at least that I found personally. So did a lot of riding on the course over that period of time. And my thinking behind doing this stair-step approach is that when you go to altitude, your training takes a hit. And the higher, the higher you go, the bigger a hit it takes, and your intensity takes a hit, and your recovery takes a hit, and you just can't train. You can't train at the same intensity and the same volume. So and this is, interestingly enough, this is not what you want to be happening with your training when you're a month out from your biggest race of the season. So when you're in the last month before the biggest race of your season, you don't want to be decreasing your training intensity, and you don't want your recovery to take a huge hit. So it's kind of a balancing act, and so it's part of the reason why I did this stair-step approach. I started with 6,000 feet coming from. I mean, I'm close to sea level here on the East Coast, but so we consider 6,000 feet high altitude, but people in Colorado, that's just normal altitude for them. But using this approach, when you get to 6,000 feet, you can still train and recover, and you give your body a little bit of time to adapt, and then you're like, all right, let's bump it up a little bit more. Let's bump it up a little bit more, and it's not quite such a shock to your system all at once. Going straight from sea level to 10,000 feet. And I actually thought that the approach worked pretty well. There wasn't a point where I felt like my sleep took a big hit. There wasn't a point where I felt like my recovery took a big hit. I was still able to do my hard workouts on the bike. So if I were to do Leadville again, which hopefully I'll be doing Leadville again in 2023, I'll probably do a similar approach. I was actually really happy with how that approach went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, would there be any tweaks you would make to the approach?
Yeah, I mean, I could play around with exactly what altitude I'm staying at. So, for example, I went 6, 7, 9, 10. So I guess I skipped 8 in there. You kind of run into logistical problems where you actually have to physically find a town with good riding that's at these altitudes, right? I think that probably had I done it perfectly, I might have spent some time at 8,000 feet before I went to 9 before going to 10.
I got one word for you, man. Breckenridge.
Yeah. I could have stayed at Breckenridge. I think this is what I'm talking about logistically. I think the houses in Breckenridge were just so expensive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And actually, that does get to something that I wanted to ask about. I mean, you just mentioned at the beginning that you're fortunate in that you can work from anywhere, and so you can do that. How about for our listeners? Some of us are lucky enough that, we too could work anywhere, and so could sort of work our way up the altitude chain. For folks who can't, right, who have a normal, say, 14 days of PTO per year, days off, what should they do? And I'm asking you to kind of put it on something between your coaching hat and your experienced pro hat.
I've done a video on altitude training where I've reviewed the literature on altitude training. And I know that a lot of coaches have this, it's a very common idea that you either want at least 2 weeks at altitude, or if you can't do that, then spending a week at altitude or 5 days is like the worst. You shouldn't do that. You should either, if you can't spend 2 weeks at altitude, then you should just arrive like the day before. And while that's not going to be optimal, it's better than the alternative, which is spending 3 or 4 days at altitude, which is supposedly the worst. And I got to be honest with you. I mean, I believe that for a long time, but when I look at the research on altitude, it's not as clear cut as that. And there are studies that show that that athletes actually perform better after staying at altitude for 3 days than staying at altitude for 0 days, right? And then there's some research that does suggest that 3 to 4 days is a bad period of time to be spending at altitude. Like your sleep is the worst during that period of time. Your recovery is the worst during that period of time. A lot of people feel like they have dead legs after 3 days, that sort of thing. And my conclusion to that video was that there are a lot of aspects of altitude that are very individual. I think different people respond to altitude differently. There's some people that respond really well to altitude. There's some people that don't respond well to altitude. There's some people that respond quickly to altitude. There's some people respond slowly to altitude. There's some people who experience altitude sickness. Some people don't. Some people experience sleep problems. Some people don't. Basically, what I'm getting at here is that I think the reason why the evidence is mixed in the literature is because there's so much individual variability with altitude. So my recommendation for people is hopefully you have some altitude experience, whether it's racing or not. Maybe you just went on a ski trip when you were younger or something. Hopefully you've been to high altitude before, so you have some idea of how your body responds to altitude. And I would this is one of those scenarios where I would really base it off of your experience with altitude. You know, when you go to altitude, do you feel good after 3 days or do you not feel good after 3 days? And that's kind of my recommendation, as opposed to making some sort of blanket recommendation like 3 days is terrible, don't spend 3 days at altitude. I think there are actually some people that could perform better with 3 days at altitude, and there's probably some people who wouldn't, if that makes sense.
Hadi, last year here in Utah, we had a bumper crop of goat heads. I'm still harvesting those goat heads at the rate of a couple pretty much every time I go riding right now.
Those things are the worst, or at least they used to be back when we all rolled with tubes. It seems like back then we spent more time changing tubes than riding.
Yeah, it was that way for me too. I was thinking about that in a recent ride when I picked up a goat head. You know, it used to be back in the day, ride ending after a couple of them. Now, I don't even bother picking them out. I know that the sealant is going to take care of it.
The only problem with good sealant is that it eventually tends to jam up your valve core.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have a core removal tool, you've got yourself a different problem.
Yeah, a new problem. Actually, I've got the coolest little solution for you here. And for me and for our listeners, Envy has a nice little valve core removal tool that is also your valve stem protector. Honestly, until recently, I didn't even know these existed, but they are the smartest thing. They look like just a Envy branded valve stem cap, but when you twist them off, flip them over, they're a valve core removal tool. I am putting one on every stem I've got.
And it looks like a pair of them are just $5. That's good insurance that looks good from the makers of the best carbon wheels and components. Check them out at envy.com. That's ENVE.com. Okay, more now with Dylan Johnson and getting ready for altitude. We also take a look at using a power meter and how to monitor your heart rate during the hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country.
Knowing your own experience with altitude, I really do think is key. You know, I have lived at very high altitude. I've lived at very low altitude. And I know that, I mean, there were times when I would come up and do the Leadville race from when I lived, this is back when I lived in Seattle, and, at sea level, I would come up 3 days later, do the race. And I don't think, at least in my own head, that I felt any different than the times when, most of the years I've done Leadville, I come from Utah at around 6,000 feet and did it. It has to do with, I know how I feel when I get to 11,000 feet and how much that changes. I mean, I'm sure there is a difference, but how a lot of it is in your head, right? And everyone feels kind of lousy at 11,500 feet. And that just, that is not going to change no matter what. But I am interested. I mean, during the race itself, how did you feel at high altitude after using your stair step approach?
I mean, a lot of the race, I felt pretty good. I would say that the biggest shock to me was that I really appeared to lose a lot of power in the last 2 hours of a race, which I wasn't necessarily expecting, because I'm very used to 100-mile mountain bike racing. I've done, I don't know how many, probably 40 100-mile mountain bike races in my life, maybe more than that, maybe 50 or 60 100-mile mountain bike races. It's a distance and a discipline that I'm very used to. I'm just not used to the altitude. So I was a bit surprised with how my performance really seemed to go off a cliff at 5 hours in. And it's something that I had in the back of my head as this might happen, because I know that hitting the wall at altitude is more likely than hitting the wall at sea level. And I mean, I from my own personal experience and from talking with people about doing Leadville, I would certainly say that is the case. It pacing at altitude is even harder than pacing at sea level, and people already screw up pacing at sea level all the time. So
yeah, we're going to get into a pacing discussion with Dylan in a minute here, but we want to catch up with the watts. The watts you saw, and by the way, Dylan rode with a power meter at Leadville, which Fatty and I have like zero experience with. Like we always tell people, leave the power meter at home. That's becoming more and more of a problem for folks because they're just on bikes now. Like people just have power meters. So you had a power meter, Dylan, and I believe you consulted it, correct, during your race. You raced with your power meter. What did your power meter tell you about what was happening with you physiologically and what was happening with your expectations as you rode?
So if you're going to race with a power meter at Leadville, make sure that you have your expectations set correctly, especially if you're coming from sea level. So if you're coming from sea level and you're used to seeing sea level power outputs, and then you get to Leadville race day and you start riding, and you have not adjusted your expectations, your power meter is only going to depress you, and the negative feedback that you're getting from your power meter is probably just going to result in a worse performance, to be honest with you, because the power numbers will be significantly lower than what you're used to seeing. So, I mean, I think just as an example, I used a conversion equation in my video to convert the altitude power to the sea level power. And I actually did that. The number that I used in the conversion was slightly different based off of where I was in the course. So the course kind of dips into 9,000 feet at certain parts. So I was using 9,000, my theoretical sea level at 9,000 feet for that part. And then obviously at the top of Columbine, you're at over 12,000 feet. So I'm using my theoretical sea level conversion from 12,000 for that part. But throughout the video, I'm giving my theoretical sea level power so that the viewers who are probably more used to seeing sea level power can get an idea of what the physiological cost of me riding at this certain pace was, because the power numbers, when I just talk about them on the video or when you're seeing them in real time, seem so pitiful. So that's I would get very familiar with, even if you're not at altitude, what I would do is I would get very familiar with that conversion and just and you know, you don't need to know the conversion off the top of your head, but a lot of times it's as simple as, you know, depending on where you're coming from, adding 50 watts to whatever you're doing. So, you know, if you're riding up a climb at 200 watts and you're like, oh man, I can only do 200 watts right now. Are you kidding me? Like, this is my zone 2 back at sea level. Add 50 watts to that. That's probably what you would be doing if you were down at sea level.
Were you monitoring in real time when you raced this year? Were you doing the math, in other words, as you raced?
Yeah, I mean, I had a rough idea of what a certain power number felt like at altitude, and I had the benefit of actually riding at Leadville altitude for 2 weeks before this race, so I had an idea of what these efforts felt like before the race even happened. Not everyone has that luxury, but I also had in my head, I was like, yeah, if I'm riding at 200 watts, that's probably more equivalent to me doing 250 watts or 260 watts if I was down at sea level right now. So I didn't get all in my head if I was doing a climb and I saw that my power was pitifully low. I was expecting that.
And so would you recommend power meters to the first timer, to somebody who's not racing the Leadville Trail 100 and just trying to finish it?
I would. And here's why. Pacing at an ultra endurance race in general is something that most people screw up. I say this time and time again. I mean, it's almost a universal law that your power is just going to drop throughout the race. And I've looked at so many power files from ultra endurance races at this point as a cycling coach to know this. It's like 99% of the racers are going to see their power drop throughout the race. And I would say that only gets worse the higher you get in altitude. People underestimate the altitude and their power drops throughout the race at an even sharper rate than when they're down at sea level. And I mean, one way to try to combat that is to have a power meter and actually look at it while you're racing. And Leadville is a race where you can do that because while it is a mountain bike race, and there are some mountain bike races where it's nearly impossible to pace with the power meter because you're on a trail and the power is constantly spiking, I would say look at your heart rate more in that scenario. But Leadville is a race where you've got these long climbs and you've got these long sustained efforts. And when you're doing a long climb, a power meter is great for pacing. So I would have, hopefully you have an idea, if you're a first timer for Leadville, hopefully you have an idea of what kind of power is sustainable for whatever duration of time that you expect to be finishing this race in, whether that's 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours plus. Hopefully you have some idea of what power you can do at sea level, and what is sustainable for you at sea level. And then I would do the conversion for your sea level power to this altitude power, and just keep that in mind when you're racing. You're going to want to go a little bit harder than that on the climbs, but again, I think a power meter could be incredibly useful for as a pacing tool, as well as heart rate.
And I want to ask you a little bit about heart rate because, I mean, while some people have power, almost everyone has access to a heart rate monitor. And in this show, I've advocated for sure, wear a heart rate monitor and look at it afterward. But maybe you don't want to look at your heart rate during the race for kind of similar reasons that you're describing about power, that it can depress you and, do a negative morale feedback loop where it's like, oh man, I started way too high and I'm hitting the ceiling way too soon. What I know, of course, as a coach, you probably give advice and maybe sort of consulted yourself during the race. What do you do about heart rate at altitude?
Yeah, I mean, during the race, I'll look at both heart rate and power simultaneously. I mean, I know that there are probably some people who maybe looking at it is going to get in their head and it's going to produce a bad performance. But I would encourage people to understand the numbers and use it as a pacing tool. And I would hope that if you are looking at your heart rate and you're seeing that you're getting really close to your max heart rate, or you're going over your threshold heart rate, or your heart rate is way higher than it should be, then that is a sign to back it off. That's not a sign to say, I don't want to look at this right now. Let me just keep my head down and keep smashing it. Because that will come back to bite you later, especially at Leadville.
Yeah, it also can be a sign that something seriously is going wrong, like maybe you're not hydrated properly and your body's trying to respond to that. I mean, the heart rate can tell you something. I realize that you can't expect 100% accuracy like you can from your power meter, from your heart rate monitor, but it can send signals and say, hey, something's amiss here. Maybe you want to check into that.
Again, thanks to Dylan Johnson. If you want to hear more about the pacing Dylan mentioned, go back to episode 10 from this season. Dylan has a great plan for getting your pace spot on. And if you're interested in how to race with a power meter at Leadville, we'll have an entire feature dedicated to that a little later this season.
For now, let's wrap this episode. Fatty and I are on social media, most notably Instagram for me, where I'm at Michael Houghton.
And I'm Fat Cyclist. That's 2 words, Fat and Cyclist. My first and last names on Strava. Give me a follow.
You'll find both Fatty and me on the Leadville 100 mountain bike participants page. And if you want to have a conversation, join our Slack channel. You'll find a link to it over at leadville.fm/Slack.
If you like the show, go to wherever you listen and give us a 5-star rating, write us a review, and then check out all the ways you can find this show all over at leadville.fm. Good luck in your riding, your racing, your recovery. Thanks for listening, and we're going to see you in just 2.5 months, I think, at the starting line.